One of my favorite exercises for improving my Photoshop skills is to rework old photographs, like this image I took on a trip to China 7 years ago. It's a great way to reinforce important lessons through repetition and to learn how to prepare old images to print for new clients. So let's see how we can improve on this old version. As you can see in my original edit, I have just 2 layers, and I didn't do a great job of naming them, so all I know is that I have an HDR on the bottom. I don't know which exposures, how many, or what settings, but this is the foundation for my image, and then I made corrections with a raw to deal with issues like, now if we look down on this flower here, in the original HDR, there's these artifacts, things like these ghosted areas that look just awful, typical of HDR, and so I blended in a correction for another raw to smooth that out and fix that. Also, if we look at the flower details in the HDR, things are a little bit off, and so I tried to fix the color with this correcting layer. And overall, things look really good. I'd like to maintain the characteristics of this image, so rather than starting over from scratch, let's keep what we have here and just improve it, which is what I typically need to do when I'm going to print an image for a client. So this is a very important skill to hone. Let's take a look at the game plan for this. I'm going to create a new blank layer here to just quickly draw on and explain my thought process here. Up top is a lot of environmental haze that is typical in night skies in a city. I want to knock this down to be, more black and just, make the sky look a little darker, help this stand out. Also, of course, things are pretty overblown with these lower level flower petals, and I'd like to restore more of the highlight detail there. These trees in the background, they're not too bad, but if we zoom in, they're certainly blown out, and I think we can do a better job with some of these areas here. Probably won't get them perfect, but certainly better so they don't look white and just totally blown out. Looking down in the water here, this is something very peculiar to older cameras like the D800 I was shooting, but you can see that there are these vertical streaks in the water, and that's just in every single raw I shot. It's just something about this scene and the capabilities of that camera, it didn't work very well. So I want to fix this as well, and I've got some tricks that I'll show you in Lightroom in a moment. And then lastly, I think these trees on the right here are purple, and while I do have some other colored trees for the left side from some of my unused exposures, rather than matching with purple trees on the left, I'd rather just make these green so that the flower sculpture and its reflection in the middle stand out as the primary subjects. That's what I want to highlight in this image. So I think when we make those changes, it's going to be a subtle improvement to the image that's really going to look a lot better, especially if I were to print this image at a larger size. So let's go and just quickly duplicate this. And on top here, we'll just call it our new edit and get rid of that layer. So now we'll be able to compare these at the end. Jumping over into Lightroom, I've got my original image here that I've already edited, and then 3 virtual copies of RAWs that I've prepared for this demo. I've got one for fixing that reflection, one for fixing the flower petals, and then lastly, one for fixing these trees in the background here. Now diving into this water one, if we just take a look in the develop module, this one I've made some unusual moves because I had those streaks of light down in the water. And in order to fix that, I basically had to obliterate small detail, which is okay to do because it's a reflection. And so I can get away with that. I don't need all the same detail. So what I've done is I pulled down the texture. And then of course, if we look down in the detail area here, I've taken the luminance noise reduction up quite a bit to help wipe out those areas and remove those vertical lines from the image. Now in doing so, the flowers and other detail got a bit soft. And the way to fix that, because it's just a simple reflection, was to boost the clarity. So overall, that's given me a much better starting point for the water that I can blend in. Jumping to the next exposure for these flower petals here, it's pretty simple. I've just simply taken an image and made a couple of tonal adjustments to get something that I think looks like a better version to blend in here with some luminosity masks. And then for the background area here, I've also made some basic exposure adjustments as well as going down into the HSL area and just adjusting the yellows and greens a bit for luminance, as well as changing the red hue a bit to just get things to match a little bit better here as the various colors are getting blown out and just trying to separate the greens and the yellows appropriately. So just some quick little changes here to give me a better layer for blending. Now at this point, what I need to do is send these 3 layers over to Photoshop to combine with my existing edit I already have open. And typically I'd right click and go edit in, open as a smart object. If I do that, what I'm going to be opening up are 3 layers that just have filed numbers as they were shot on the camera. But if you look on these individual images, I've given them names to call out this is for the yellow highlights, and this is for the flower highlights, and this is for the reflection. I want to preserve those names. So what I'm going to do instead is click on all three of these and go to export. I've got this Photoshop temp original preset that I've created. And what it does is sends over the original file to Photoshop, and this will preserve the raw. But what I can do is turn on the renaming feature, and I'm going to go and instead of having the file name be in there, I'm going to go and insert the title. So I'm going to get things like reflection, and that's going to better help me understand what layer has what purpose. So let's go and export these, and we'll then jump right over to Photoshop. And you can see that we've got the three opening up in Adobe Camera Raw. If I shift click to make sure all three are selected, I can choose Open Objects. If you're not seeing this by default, just hold the Shift key and it'll toggle between Open and Open Objects. Click on Open Objects and it's going to open all three of these as Camera Raw Smart Objects in separate files. So you can see we've got our original we were working on, and then we've got these three individual files. And as noted by the Basics panel, the Raw button lights up green when the current layer is a raw smart object. So we've imported them as we want, preserving all the raw detail for the future. We just need to put these into our blend. If we click on the blend, we can go click on Pre-Blend in Lumenzia, and it will detect that we already have a layered image and offer to add to the current document. It's going to import these layers into this image. And I just need a couple of options here. I'm going to add black masks, as I usually do for blending. I also want to use check alignment, which is going to put things into a mode where we can help manually align, and you'll see why in just a moment. And here's the issue. You can see that the target document is a little bit smaller than the layers we're adding. It's just off by like a couple of pixels, but the HDR process originally eliminated a few pixels. And so now things are going to be misaligned. We're going to have to manually align them because we're working with raw smart objects. So that's why I chose to use that check difference option. I'm going to say no to enlarging the canvas. I'm going to say, let's go ahead and close our other source documents. And now we have everything in one image. And it looks pretty weird because what happens with check alignment is that the layer gets put into difference blend mode. And in difference blend mode, things that are black are the same and things that stand out are different. And where we are misaligned, you're going to have a strong difference. So let's zoom in and look for things not like leaves, but more, solid objects. And those edges, you can see where it's white, is pretty misaligned. So if I click on this layer, hit V for the move tool, and I don't want to use the mouse here. I can be much more precise with the keyboard. Just click the arrow keys and kind of nudge it one pixel at a time until we eliminate those edges. That looks like that's going to be better alignment. Now I'm going to switch back to the normal blend mode on this layer and just toggle it off and on, and you can see that that is properly aligned. Now we go to the next layer. Same thing here. It's in difference blend mode. V for our move tool, and just kind of move it until it looks like it's aligned. Switch it to normal, and toggling back and forth. It looks like I missed. So what's happening? If I click it on, it's going up and to the right. So let's go down one, left one, try that. And now it's aligned. Then on top here, let's turn this on. V for our move tool, get that aligned. Hopefully that's right. Let's see how we did. Go click on normal, and from before to after, that's properly aligned. So now we have our three imported layers with the names of what we're going to do with them on top. And I'm just going to move them into the new edit and kind of hide the original edit there. So now we can start working with this and go about fixing everything. So the first thing that I'm thinking about is let's fix this correction layer because it has some important details. If I shift click on it, you can see it's darker in the sky. And I should have blended into these sky areas, but back when I did this, I wasn't very skilled with luminosity masks and wouldn't have known how to blend in the sky without hitting the trees. But that's a pretty trivial thing to do now with luminosity masks. So let's go and fix that. What I'm going to do is create a rough selection of the sky area. And a great tool for that is the quick select. So hit W for the quick select and just drag across the sky. And of course, just grab some trees, which we'll use some luminosity to eliminate, but I'm going to go and just hold Alt. And as we hold Alt, that's going to help us remove areas from this quick selection to just make it a better starting point, something like this. And again, it's not perfect. It doesn't need to be. The luminosity is going to help us improve things when we combine this area with the preview I'm about to create. So if I click on D for darks, it's going to help us target the dark area. So what we're going to get is anything that's white inside of these marching ants. And I'm going to make this a little darker. So if I grab the slider down to maybe darks 3, I think that's going to be a little bit better. And now I can load this as a selection to paint in these areas on my layer mask. So I click on cell to load this as a selection. And I'm going to choose to feather it by a couple of pixels because this quick select is not perfect. So we'll just soften the edges and rely on the combination of this softened selection and the luminosity to give us a better targeting of that sky area. Now with that, I'm hitting B for my brush, switching to white paint, make sure the layer mask is our active place. And I'm going to click to protect my pixels so I can't paint on the image, only on the mask. And now just go in here with much lower flow, something below 10% is probably ideal. Maybe, I don't know, something like, it's really hard to do this sometimes, right around 10%. And I'm just going to go and brush these areas and kind of knock that haze down a bit here. Now I can hit Command Z to look before and after. And I didn't do anything because I was painting with black. So let's go and switch that to white. I'm not sure what I did there. And now brush with the white through that selection, and that's going to knock things back here. And now I see it's doing what it's supposed to do. And now hitting Command Z from before to after. And that's pretty good, but I don't want to go quite as far here. I'm going to knock some of these edges down further. I can grab this fade slider in the basics panel and get just the amount I want. So if here would be the previous step, and here's half of that brushed in there. Now in these areas, I can use a smaller brush and go in for a second time, try and darken this at the edges a little bit where it's really bright there. Just that blends in a little bit better. And I think overall, that is a better looking sky. So I think we're doing pretty good there. If we zoom in, the rest of that layer is, I think, fine. I wouldn't mind knocking a few of these areas back. In the areas, I need the artifacts to come out of the HDR. That needs to remain. But some of these areas in the middle could perhaps be a little bit less. So what I'm going to do here is B for my brush, switch to black, and just brush out the middle of the image. And what I'm doing is I'm just fully kind of removing that area in the greens. And then I'm going to use the fade slider and just come back to maybe only do about a third of that. So I'm knocking out some of that and restoring a little bit more detail in the greens. So that I think is looking a little bit better there. So next up, why don't we work on these flower highlights? And for that, we just zoom in, let's activate them, and we'll create a selection of the brightest areas here to blend in. So let's hit Command D to deselect, and we'll start new by clicking on L in Lumenzia for a lights preview. I think that looks pretty good, so I'll just load that as a selection. And now clicking on its layer mask to make it active, hitting B for my brush, switching to white paint, I can just paint with white paint through that selection, which helps me reveal the details of that flower. And I'm painting pretty aggressively. Not too worried about spilling over because the selection I used was not based on what you're seeing right now. It was based on this darker exposure. If I shift click it, you can see it's based on this. So it's not going to hit too much of the trees on the side here and such. And then same thing over here. We can bring through some more detail. Maybe shrink it down a little bit and just trying to hit the outer edges a little stronger. And I'm not trying to restore every blown detail. It would never look correct to have a directly lit LED like this be fully visible in the middle of the night, but just enough to bring back the important details to make it look more realistic. So from before to after, you can see that's looking much better. So I think we've got the flower highlights there. The reflection of the flower we'll deal with using our reflection layer. So let's hit Command D to deselect and just take a look in this area down here. Now again, the primary problem here is going to be this reflected area where you get these streaks of just artifact from the camera. When you turn on this layer, we're getting that fixed, but the layer is changing these. So I'm not sure I want to paint over these areas too much. I kind of like the original. It looks pretty good to me. But there's some things I like about the darkened exposure here. It does look like it balances better, whereas it's a bit blown out in the HDR. So let's click on this and just B for our brush. Maybe 10% ought to be fine. We're going to paint with white without any selection at all. We just need to not paint on these trees because it is a longer exposure and they're a bit fuzzy. But as I brush in these areas here, it's a pretty easy thing to hit. We're just trying to bring through a better version of this image in the water, and water is really, really forgiving. So maybe not go too much if I switch to black and kind of knock that back. I don't want that blown area there. The water was moving. There must have been some wind or something, and it changed that reflection. So let's zoom in and just see what we have here. From before, we've got all those vertical nasty streaks that wouldn't look nice in a large print, to after, where we've removed them, not entirely, but mostly. I could spend a little more time to really knock them out. And actually, I guess if I brush a little bit more, I'm getting more of that. If you ever shift click, you can see the whole layer, and you see that's what you're blending in. And I did pretty much remove it in the raw. It's so faint at this point, you wouldn't notice unless you'd seen this version of it. So, and obviously I didn't brush as well down here. So let's make sure we just brush aggressively and restore or show this corrective layer here to get rid of that. And then just moving around the water to see if it occurred anywhere else. I don't really see it. The rest of it looks fine. So I can't explain why that artifact is in some parts of the image and not others. It just is, and we have to deal with it. So next up, we've got the yellow highlights, which are meant to deal with these areas behind the tree. Obviously, the characteristics of what I've chosen here are a bit different, but I just think kind of a warmer version, brushing that in could be interesting. And obviously, Photoshop's running a little bit slow at the moment here. But that's what I'm going to brush in, is these areas here. And there's still some areas that are blown out in my new raw. It's not perfect. That's not my point. I just think it looks a little strange. And if we really dig in here, the HDR has some little dots and bad pixels where there's some kind of misalignment. So there's just a variety of little things that you would never see on social media, but for a print, I think we can do better. So let's click on L to target the lighter pixels in this image. I think a pretty loose selection would make sense. I'm going to go all the way to L1. And then I don't want to paint too much on these green areas or the magenta and that sort of thing. So I can customize the preview if I just double click on the color conversion and just knock out the colors I don't need, which basically what I want are the reds and yellows, and probably a little more red than yellow. Kind of hard to really know, but those areas seem to have a bit of red. So I'm going to be brushing on these areas. It is going to hit some of the flower petals here, and I might have to back it off, but that's pretty good. If I really wanted to just only target these yellow areas, I could instead do a color-based selection or some combination, but that's going to be purely on color without the luminosity. So here I'm getting a little bit of both. So multiple different ways to work with color and lumencia. I'm going to use this approach, and it should work really well. So click on cell to load that as our active selection. Clicking on our mask to make it active. B for our brush. And again, just start brushing on these areas to reveal that layer. And you can see already it's starting to make a nice improvement. Again, not going to be perfect. That's not my goal here. My goal is to be acceptably better and just hide some of what's wrong in the original. Had I done this from the beginning using exposure blending with luminosity masks, I would never have these issues. I wouldn't have fully blown trees, and I certainly could fix all this. But I think for the sake of my purposes here, it's not necessary to spend that much time on it. I just want it to be a little bit better for a reasonable size print. But just know that if we needed to, we could really dive into the exposure blending techniques and fully fix this. But I don't think we need that here. All right, so taking a look at that from before to after, I think that's just doing a nice job of hiding some of those blemishes. Let's zoom back, and then we've got to deal with these trees. Let's deselect, and we've got a couple ways we could approach these trees. We could do an HSL adjustment, but we're going to have to work with hue, saturation, and luminance, and sometimes I don't get the best result with something like an LED light replacement. So what I'm going to do instead is just recolor them with a solid color layer. So I can click on solid color in lumencia, and I can go and sample a color that, let's go slide over to the left here, and maybe we'll target something like one of these kind of yellowish tree leaves right there and pick that. It's not going to be perfect. We'll have to adjust it in a moment. It's just going to be a good starting point. And lumencia's put in soft light blend mode. What I want to do is switch over to color, which is going to pull in hue and saturation. That's what color means. And so the whole image is being recolored. What I need to do now is target only the pixels, which are this blue magenta color, and that's easy to do by Clicking on color in Lumenzia would just tell it we want blue and magenta by checking them. Clicking on layer mask is going to create a layer mask on this layer that targets those pixels. If I alt click it, you can see we've got that mask, and now the recoloring comes through to those areas. And as I said, it's not the perfect color, it's too brown, but now that we can actually see it, we can fix it. So let's double click on the solid color, move it out of the way so we can see better, and just move through HSB one at a time to get the color we want. The first is the hue. To my eye, that is definitely too brown, and I'm going to slide it up closer to green until I get something like that. I think looks better. And then at this point, I think the saturation could be dialed back. Those trees look a little too much. So just bring it back until I feel like it's kind of blending in, and that's starting to match pretty nicely. The brightness is effectively the strength of the color in a way. It's also the overall brightness. So as we kick that up, we can take a look at whether that affects things, and color is hue and saturation, but things aren't quite so simple in Photoshop, and it's worth still playing with this. So the effect here may not show on YouTube. It's very subtle, but there's a little bit of a shift there. And I'm going to dial the saturation back one last time right there. And let's just zoom back and see before and after. It's fixing the trees over there, which I think looks pretty good, but obviously it's hitting the whole image. I don't want to change these flowers and the sky and all that. So we need to better target this just to this part of the image. And the way to do that is to put a secondary mask on it. So I'm going to alt click on group, which gives us a black layer mask. Now with this active, hitting B for my brush, be a bit bigger, I'm going to reveal the corrections we just made, but only on the right side of the image where we've got this purplish LED lighting, and just correct that. And so now that looks like it balances much better and you don't really notice it. So just taking a look overall, we had our original image here, which had these defects down below. We had a lot of blown pixels in the middle of the image here with both the flowers in the background. Sky was overdone. These trees on the right are too magenta. To the final image, we've corrected these things, and in a print, those changes are going to make a huge difference. Now click to this next video to learn all about exposure blending from start to finish.